Maria Gasha had always been the picture of a devoted wife and mother. She married Giulio, a well-established businessman, when she was just 22 years old. Their wedding had been grand, celebrated by everyone in their small town in Mexico. Giulio, with his charming personality and hard-working nature, was admired by all. Together they built a comfortable life. They had 2 young children, a house in a peaceful neighborhood, and all the luxuries anyone could want. On the outside, their life seemed perfect. But like many seemingly flawless marriages, there was more beneath the surface. Giulio was often busy with his business. He traveled frequently for work, leaving Maria alone with the children for long stretches of time. Maria, once an energetic and passionate woman, found herself becoming increasingly lonely and unfulfilled. Giulio was a loving husband, but their relationship had become routine, predictable. The spark that had once brought them together was dimming, and Maria couldn't help but feel the absence of excitement in her life. Maria had never imagined she would find herself in this situation. She had always considered herself a loyal wife and mother, doing everything she could to keep her family happy, but the loneliness began to wear on her. She missed the feeling of being desired, of being truly seen by someone. As she drifted further into isolation, she started seeking out small moments of companionship wherever she could. At first, it was just small conversations with neighbors and friends, but soon her interactions with Giulio's father, Don Carlos, began to take a strange turn. Don Carlos had lived with the family ever since Giulio had inherited his father's estate. He was a proud, imposing figure, with years of wisdom etched into his features. Despite his age, he was sharp and could still charm people with his charisma. Maria had always respected him, but there was something different about the way he spoke to her in recent months. His compliments were more frequent, his gaze lingered a little too long. Maria tried to ignore it at first, but soon his attention began to feel less like respect and more like something else, something more intimate. At first, Maria convinced herself it was harmless. Don Carlos was old, after all, and had probably just grown more affectionate in his years. But as time passed, she found herself looking forward to their interactions. The way he praised her cooking, complimented her appearance, and asked her about her day made her feel important. It was a validation she hadn't felt in years. The attention from Giulio had waned, replaced by work and the responsibilities of fatherhood. But Don Carlos made her feel seen, desired in a way that she hadn't realized she craved. Maria couldn't deny the growing attraction. She often found herself thinking about their conversations long after they were over. Don Carlos's presence in her life became a source of comfort, even excitement. The emotional connection that began to form between them felt real, something genuine in a life that had become predictable. However, Maria was deeply conflicted. She loved Giulio, or at least the man he had once been, but the man who had replaced him was distant and uninvolved. The spark in her marriage had long since faded. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but at that moment, the guilt was not enough to stop the growing desire she felt. Maria was on the verge of something she never could have anticipated, and it would only be a matter of time before everything in her life, her marriage, her family, her future would change forever. The connection between Maria and Don Carlos deepened in ways she had never expected. What started as innocent, passing interactions soon turned into something more deliberate. They found themselves spending more time together, often when Giulio was away on one of his many business trips. While Maria took care of the household duties, Don Carlos would often sit in the living room, reading the newspaper or sipping his coffee, and they would talk for hours. At first, the conversations were light-hearted. They talked about the past, about family, about Giulio's childhood, and about the local happenings in their small town. But as days turned into weeks, those discussions began to take a more intimate turn. Don Carlos would comment on Maria's appearance, not in the casual, familial way one might expect, but with a sharp, almost seductive edge. He would tell her how beautiful she looked, how the years had only enhanced her grace. Maria initially brushed off these remarks as harmless flattery, knowing they weren't meant with any real intent. But as his compliments grew more frequent and direct, a seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. Maria was a woman who had always prided herself on her loyalty to her husband. Yet, the compliments from Don Carlos stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in years. There was an intimacy in his words that Giulio no longer offered. It wasn't just his attention that Maria craved, but the way Don Carlos made her feel special, desired, even powerful. The more they spent time together, the more she began to look forward to his visits. The first time they touched was an accident, or so Maria tried to convince herself. Don Carlos had reached out to steady her as she nearly tripped over a rug, and his hand lingered on her waist longer than necessary. It wasn't an inappropriate touch, not in the way one might expect, but to Maria, it felt like an electric current that shot through her. She quickly pulled away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotions, but Don Carlos simply smiled, as if nothing had happened. Yet in her mind, the seed of attraction had been planted. It wasn't long after that moment that the physical tension between them began to mount. Don Carlos would sit closer to her on the couch, his hand occasionally brushing against hers. Maria found herself drawn to him in a way she never thought possible. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was overshadowed by an overwhelming need to feel something, anything. Her marriage had become a routine of empty gestures, while with Don Carlos every word, every look felt like it mattered. One afternoon, Giulio was away on one of his frequent business trips, and Don Carlos had stayed behind to rest in his room. Maria was tidying up the house when he appeared at the door of the kitchen, a familiar glint in his eyes. He invited her to join him for a drink in the living room, and this time, Maria didn't hesitate. She sat with him, exchanging casual words, but her mind was clouded with the tension that had been building between them for weeks. As they sipped their drinks in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, Don Carlos leaned forward and cupped her cheek. His touch was tender, but Maria could feel her heart race in her chest. She wanted to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, her breath quickening. Don Carlos, reading the unspoken invitation in her eyes, closed the distance between them, kissing her softly at first. The kiss deepened, and everything that had been brewing inside Maria exploded. In that moment, she felt wanted alive and consumed by a passion she had long since buried. What had begun as innocent companionship now spiraled into a passionate, illicit affair. They kept it hidden, of course no one could ever know. But for Maria, the thrill of their secret relationship was intoxicating. With each stolen moment, with each stolen kiss, she felt a rush that had long since faded in her marriage. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but in that moment it felt too good to stop. Every day the affair drew her in deeper, and she was no longer sure if she could break free. As weeks passed, the affair between Maria and Don Carlos grew bolder, and the secrets they were trying to keep hidden began to take a toll on their lives. Giulio, the ever-dedicated husband, began to sense a shift in his wife's behavior. At first, he chalked it up to the stresses of managing the household while he was away on business trips. Maria had always been a hands-on mother and wife, so her distance seemed out of character. But there was something in her eyes, a hesitation, a nervousness that he couldn't ignore. The once warm and affectionate moments between them were now replaced with awkward silences and short exchanges. Maria was no longer as present when Giulio was home. She seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else. He found her in the middle of the night, staring out the window, lost in thought. Whenever he asked if something was wrong, she would brush it off with a vague answer. The subtle changes in her behavior didn't escape Giulio's notice. He started to feel a nagging suspicion grow in the pit of his stomach. One day, after returning early from a business trip, Giulio caught Maria in a lie. She had told him she was going to visit a friend, but when he arrived home unexpectedly, he found her at home alone. The excuse she gave was flimsy, and the lie left him unsettled. He began to watch her more closely, observing her every move. Maria became more distant with each passing day, and her eyes often seemed to wander toward the direction of Don Carlos's room. Giulio, though still in denial, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His suspicions turned to dread when he started noticing the subtle signs of closeness between his father and his wife. The two of them, who had once been cordial but distant, now shared private moments, speaking in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Julio, overwhelmed by his gut feeling, started keeping track of Don Carlos's movements. He noticed the increasing frequency of their interactions and couldn't help but wonder what was really going on when he wasn't around. One night, after a particularly long day of work, Julio decided to confront his father. He walked into Don Carlos's study, finding him sitting at his desk writing a letter. The two men exchanged a few words about the day's events, but the tension in the air was palpable. Julio, unsure of how to approach the topic, asked his father if he had noticed anything unusual about Maria recently. Don Carlos, who had always been a master of manipulation, downplayed it, claiming that Maria was simply stressed. He reassured Julio that nothing was amiss, that she was just going through a phase. But his evasive answers only made Julio's suspicions grow stronger. The tipping point came a few days later when Julio came home unexpectedly from another business trip. He had been planning on surprising Maria with a quiet evening together, hoping to repair the distance between them. But when he arrived, he was greeted with an eerie silence. The house was unusually quiet, and there were no signs of Maria or the children. Julio made his way through the house, his footsteps heavy with a sense of impending dread. He finally found them, his wife and his father, sitting too close to one another in the living room. Don Carlos's hand was resting gently on Maria's arm, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made Julio's blood run cold. He stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to process the scene before him. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His worst fear was true. The closeness he had been sensing for weeks wasn't just innocent affection, it was something far darker, far more intimate than he could have ever imagined. Maria and Don Carlos were having an affair, one that threatened to destroy everything Julio had worked so hard to build. The world he had thought he knew was crumbling around him, and in that moment, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. As the truth sunk in, Julio was consumed by a mix of shock, anger, and betrayal. He couldn't look at his wife, couldn't face the man who was supposed to be his father. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to confront them, to demand answers. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the pain of seeing his own flesh and blood, the man he had trusted most in the world, betray him in the most unimaginable way. The room felt like it was closing in on him, and all he could do was stand there, frozen, in the face of a family destroyed by lies and deceit. The confrontation was inevitable, but the moment it came, Julio was not prepared for the torrent of emotions that swept over him. He stood in the doorway, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him, choking off his breath. Maria and Don Carlos seemed frozen, as if they had just been caught in the act of something unforgivable, which in essence they had. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with betrayal, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of despair. Julio's mind raced, his thoughts a blur of shock and disbelief. He had always trusted his father, looked up to him as a man of wisdom and integrity. But now, standing there, it all seemed like a lie. Maria's face turned pale as she saw the anger and hurt in Julio's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. There was no explanation that could make this right, no justification for what had been happening behind Julio's back. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, with the very man who had given her life's foundation, the man who had raised the man she loved. Don Carlos, on the other hand, appeared unfazed, though a hint of nervousness flickered in his eyes. He had always been in control, always known how to navigate difficult situations, but now even he seemed taken aback by the depth of Julio's hurt. He didn't apologize, nor did he seem to regret what had transpired. Instead, he stood up slowly, almost as if the situation didn't concern him in the way it should have. He was the elder, the patriarch of the family, and in his mind his actions were justified, even necessary. Julio's voice, when it came, was hoarse, laced with fury. He demanded to know how long it had been going on, how long his father had been sleeping with his wife, the woman he loved, the mother of his children. His questions were like daggers, each one cutting deeper into the heart of what was left of their family. Maria, too ashamed to face him, kept her head down, unable to look at the man whose life she had just shattered. Don Carlos, who had always been a man of few words, finally spoke. His tone was calm, almost dismissive, as he tried to justify his actions. He spoke of his own desires, his own needs, and how Maria had become a source of solace for him in his later years. His words, though calculated, only deepened Giulio's sense of betrayal. He couldn't fathom how the man he had trusted most in the world, his father, the very man who had helped him become who he was, could be the one to destroy his life so completely. As the weight of the conversation sank in, Giulio's anger exploded. He lunged at Don Carlos, his fists clenched, his mind clouded with the need for vengeance. But in the heat of the moment, Maria screamed, trying to separate them. Her hands shook as she begged Giulio to calm down, to listen. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Giulio's world had been shattered beyond repair, and no words could put it back together. Maria tried to intervene, to explain herself, but nothing she said made a difference. She knew, deep down, that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her actions, fueled by a desire for passion and validation, had destroyed everything she held dear. She had betrayed her husband, her children, and herself. Her attempts to defend her choices only deepened the fracture between them. There was no escaping the harsh truth. She had chosen her own desires over the well-being of the family she had once vowed to protect. The confrontation spiraled out of control, with Giulio shouting at his father, demanding he leave the house, while Maria stood helplessly by, caught between two men, one her husband, the other her lover. It was a fight that couldn't be won, and in the end there would be no victor, only casualties. The family that had once seemed so strong, so unbreakable, was now torn apart by secrets and lies, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the aftermath of the explosion of emotions, there was a heavy silence. Giulio's heart was filled with rage and sorrow in equal measure, and Maria, though devastated by the consequences of her actions, felt as if she were sinking in a sea of guilt. The path they had all walked down was now leading to an inevitable end, one that would bring nothing but pain and destruction. The consequences of their betrayal would follow them, and the lives they had once known would be lost forever. The aftermath of the confrontation left the house in a state of stunned silence. Giulio's rage had exploded, but in the wake of the violence there was a terrible stillness. He had demanded Don Carlos leave, his words sharp and final, but his father simply stood there, unmoved. Maria too was frozen, caught between guilt and despair, as her entire world crumbled around her. She tried to explain, to apologize, but nothing could undo the damage that had been done. Giulio's trust was shattered beyond repair, and the family that had once seemed so whole was now splintered. That night, Giulio barely slept. His mind replayed every moment, every conversation, every look exchanged between Maria and Don Carlos. The images haunted him, his father, the man he had loved and admired, taking what he had once considered his. It was impossible to understand, let alone forgive. The life he had built, the family he had trusted, was now an illusion. His marriage, once the cornerstone of his existence, had been reduced to ashes. As the days passed, the tension in the house only grew. Don Carlos left, but his departure did little to ease the heaviness that hung over the family. Giulio refused to speak to Maria, his eyes filled with an icy resentment. The woman he had loved, the mother of his children, was now a stranger to him. She tried to reach out to him, but he recoiled, unable to process the betrayal. There was no room for forgiveness in his heart, no space for understanding. What Maria had done was unforgivable. Maria, too, was consumed by the weight of her actions. She had never imagined it would come to this, never thought that her affair with Don Carlos would destroy everything she held dear. But now, with the reality of what she had done sinking in, she saw no way forward. The passion she had once craved, the excitement she had sought, had led to the destruction of her family. Giulio was no longer the man she had married, and the life they had built together was now a distant memory. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, and there was no going back from that. The authorities soon became involved. Giulio, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief, finally called the police. The incident that had taken place in their home was no longer just a family dispute, it had become a criminal matter. Detective Anna Harlow was assigned to investigate the situation, and she quickly uncovered the dark truth. The affair between Maria and Don Carlos, the betrayal of trust, and the violence that had followed were all carefully pieced together. The town was in shock as the details of the scandal spread like wildfire. No one could believe the shocking turn of events that had unfolded within the walls of what had once been an ideal family. The investigation dragged on for weeks, with Maria and Don Carlos both being questioned by the authorities. Maria, unable to escape the weight of her guilt, cooperated fully with the police, confessing to the affair and explaining how the situation had spiraled out of control. But while she seemed remorseful, there was no way to undo the destruction she had caused. The damage was done, and the consequences were inevitable. Don Carlos, too, was arrested, though he seemed less concerned with the gravity of the situation. His calm demeanor and lack of remorse made him appear more dangerous, and the investigators knew that his manipulation had played a key role in the downfall of the family. The trial that followed was sensational. The details of the affair, the betrayal, and the violence were all laid bare for the public to see. The small town that had once revered Don Carlos as a man of honor now turned against him. Maria, too, became a pariah, her name forever linked to the scandal that had torn her family apart. The courtroom was filled with tension as the truth was revealed piece by piece, and the weight of the consequences became undeniable. In the end, both Maria and Don Carlos were convicted of their roles in the tragic events that had unfolded. Maria was sentenced to a long prison term, while Don Carlos, due to his age and health, received a less severe punishment. But no sentence could bring back the life that had been lost. Giulio, though he had sought justice, found little solace in the verdict. The damage to his family was irreparable. His children were left without the mother they had once known, and the family that had once been so close-knit was now fractured beyond repair. The story of the Mexican wife's secret affair with her father-in-law became a cautionary tale that would echo through the town for years to come. It was a story of passion, betrayal, and the destructive power of secrets, a reminder of how quickly a life can unravel when trust is broken. For Maria and Giulio, the future held nothing but uncertainty, and the ghosts of their past would haunt them forever.